Thank you. That was really good. I really enjoyed it. Anyway, we're now going to begin panel 4 entitled POA Consciousness. And before we begin that panel, I want to introduce our moderator, Frank Cousins. So, Frank, what did you do? Frank Cousins completed his undergraduate degree in sociology and African American studies at the University of Michigan in 2012. Since then, he has worked with the National College Advising Corps, the university, and other nonprofit organizations to improve college enrollment of underrepresented students. He is also working as a research assistant at the Ford School of Public Policy, where he will pursue his interest in educational policy and economics of education through its Masters of Public Policy program beginning this fall. Frank Cousins.
Thank you, Ryan. I don't know if you guys can hear me. Does it sound okay? All right. First, we have Rocky Block. Rocky is an HIV training coordinator and a health educator in New Orleans, Louisiana. He obtained his Bachelor's of Arts and Master's of Public Health from the University of Michigan. In 2006, he became a part of the Pedagogy of Action, and it changed his life forever. His time spent with POA from 2006 to 2010 in the US and South Africa transformed the way he viewed the world and his everyday actions. As a result, he has become a conscientized individual trying to navigate life and explore new ways of learning and translating theory into practice. Mansi Goyal, she'll be introducing herself as she begins her talk, so I'll let her do that. And finally, we have Carson Phillips. Carson is currently pursuing Masters of Arts in Educational Policy and Leadership Studies at the University of Iowa. He received his BA in Sociology and Afro-American and African Studies from the University of Michigan in 2014. Carson traveled with Dr. Hennef to South Africa in 2012 and Jamaica in 2013. As a result of his time with POA, Carson continues to remain interested in issues of equity and inclusion.
All right. Hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. So, being this idea of consciousness, I just want to start off with a quote. I have to because it's Freirean, so I gotta put everything into context a little bit. So, if you got your Bibles with you on page 69. The middle paragraph there says, "The method is, in fact, the external form of consciousness manifests in acts, which takes on the fundamental property of consciousness, its intentionality. The essence of consciousness is being with the world, and this behavior is permanent and unavoidable. Accordingly, consciousness is in essence a way towards something apart from itself, outside itself, which surrounds it and which it apprehends by means of ideational capacity. Consciousness is thus, by definition, a method in the most general sense of the word." So this method, this ideology, we keep talking about Freire, for me, all happened in 2006. It's funny how the people we meet lead to changes and more changes and more changes. So for me, I was lucky enough to meet a woman named Renee Pitter, who became a very dear sister of mine. And she was very kind enough to introduce me to Nisha and the POA. And as a part of that process, I think like a lot of other liberal people, maybe not liberal people, a lot of white people, but not just white people, want to do something, right? They want to change. Say, oh, I want to change the world. I want to do something meaningful with my life. And I was no different. But what I believed, or what my viewpoints in the world was very sort of complicated. And so the essence of POA put everything into context for me. It gave me a sense of consciousness towards something. And the method was things based off of this book, things that Nisha said, but it was also the people I interacted. People like Carson, people like Mansi, Frankie, Za, Renee, Jessica, Rangwato, Malosi. So all these interactions began to shape how I viewed the world. Me being a white male from the US, from a middle class background, allowed me to understand what those things meant. I can't deny that. A lot of white people get upset when I talk about privilege, try and deny it. I can't do anything about it, but how can I own it? And how can I become and work alongside others, working towards something other than myself? So I had my first trip, I was one of 2 men. Gabriel was the other male on the trip, and the rest of the folks were women. I was the only white man, and there was one other white woman. So I was thrust into this environment which I'd never been before. And it allowed me to understand constructs of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, nationality, and how all those things shape how I view the world. And it, as a lot of other people say, it kind of blows your mind. So what do you do with that? I'm changing the way I'm thinking, constantly re-examining myself, my beliefs. Why do I believe the way I believe? Dig deeper, peel back those layers of reality, peel those back. And so for me, I did that on the trip, and then I didn't want to stop there. So I kind of grabbed Nisha's coattails, and for the next, till now it's 2015, so it's been a hot minute. I haven't stopped. So Nisha was kind enough to take me under her wing. And the one thing I have to say about this program, and Nisha in particular, is that she can meet people where they're at, which is very instrumental for things like public health, like meeting people where they're at. She could have totally blasted me on the spot. Well, from time to time she did blast me. But she gave me little bits and pieces for me to chew on, little nuggets of thought to challenge me how I think, or why do you feel this way? Why do you believe that? And think about that, dig deeper and deeper. And as you do that, it changes how you interact with people. So the module, a good example is, I can talk about how you get HIV, I can talk about how we should reduce stigma, but if I'm still afraid to share this cup of water with someone who's HIV positive, then what am I doing? And it's a very real, concrete thing. And so trying to figure out how I take my water and share it, but what else? I have to always be conscientized about how I view the world. How does me speaking as a white man in this context, what are those elements of privilege? And owning that, and trying to figure out how to use that to make, people said to make the world a better place, but maybe make it less bad. Make it less bad. So for me, figuring out what to do next, I decided to go into public health, which I do not recommend. Because POA is not public health. And Nisha told me from the get-go, what we do is not public health. This is a totally unique way of talking about education, HIV, but it's not the predominant way that public health institutions or the paradigm is focused.
But you can use it.
What's that?
You can use it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you said that, because I've found ways to do that. So for me, I took all this very seriously, kept going back to POA, grad school, moving to Detroit, and I moved to New Orleans. And now for the past couple of years, I've been doing HIV education in New Orleans. So I work for the man now. So I work essentially for a government agency which has inherent limitations. So people want to change the world, you want to change the system, but you can't always do that. So you have to be honest with those limitations. How do I measure success? How do I get funding for this program? I can't just go around toppling structures by myself. It's not that easy. So I have to work within the system. And some people say, oh, if you work within the system, they're not really doing any change. But academia is an institution, and Nisha has worked within that system to impact all of us. So I think we need to reevaluate how we measure success, how we measure progress. Nisha, I remember a few years ago, had this conversation with a few of us in this room about, does this work? Is this worthwhile? Is this successful? And I was like, well, what if in all of our conversations, one person felt like they could use a condom, maybe just the next time they had sex? Maybe not every time, but maybe the next time. Maybe they could have a conversation with a potential partner about safer sex practices or what they want in a relationship. However you be faithful to yourself, however you define that. And if that happens one day, then the whole program is to me successful. So we have to reevaluate how we find and define success. So I work within this larger system, So how do I introduce these methods of becoming conscientized or showing and working with people towards some kind of goal? In public health, me being in HIV work, at home, has been great, and I've been able to do the module every week or so. I do the module back home. And for me, that's very important. A lot of people say, oh, HIV's in South Africa. HIV's a problem back home. Okay. So it's an ability, to want to work with people. And I have to be honest that, okay, I'm a white man in New Orleans. So how do I meet people where they're at? In New Orleans, they have a greeting that say, where you at? Where you at is a hello, but it's also a question. So where you at could be I'm down the street, but also where you at, hello, how you doing? So when I go and work with folks, I gotta ask them, where you at? Where are you at in that idea of understanding of HIV, of talking with people about how to protect themselves, reduce their harm, reduce their risk. There's also a saying that's you heard. So you heard is also sort of a statement and a question. I can say, there's 4 ways to get HIV, you heard? So do you feel me? Are you understanding? But then it's also a statement. So I'm speaking a true word. My voice matters. So when I'm talking to people who are different than me, their voice matters. So that's how I measure success. If I'm traveling around the state, I can give people little tools, little nuggets to chew on in ways that the dominant system might not support or give much value to, but I can give them value to it because I can meet them where they're at and talk about what works for them. It might be different than what works for me. But I have to always ask, where are you at?
Sorry for no bio, but what I want to speak about, I've been wanting to speak about it for a while, so this is mostly the reason I came on this trip to speak, so bear with me. My name is Mansi. I'm a POA alum from 2009 and 2012. I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Hanif as a senior in 2009. Is it working? Oh, hello? Is that okay? It's not working.
Can you turn it on?
Yes. Is that better?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. So I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Hanif in 2009 as a college senior. I was studying mathematics at the time, and I was searching for forays into public health, social justice. These were very, new concepts to me. And at the time, I had decided that I wanted to go to India after graduation, mostly to interact with my family there, and also to kind of unpack a lot of negative notions I had about this country of my origin. And I also thought, I could find perhaps a relevant opportunity to work and to see if I had the capacity to work in this field. I would say the most salient thing about POA, as I'm sure we all know and others can gather, is that the self-examination that happens initially, but that continues to happen. A little bit about me, I've grown up in the U.S. To immigrant doctor parents in mostly small white towns. My family is of an upper caste and class Hindu background of North India. And it was only through this, this process in college where I started to kind of expel my shame of being a person of color, and later on my guilt for having, caste and class privileges in India. And like we said, POA it heightens our awareness of being Americans, American, passport holders, American college degrees holders, and that I especially felt in India, where it was very easy for me to find work without much, interaction. They just saw the paper and they said, you're hired. Freire defines consciousness as learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions, and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. When I first started reading pedagogy in Dr. Hanif's class, it was a complete uphill battle. I was used to probability and differential equations. So I was trying to digest and find meaning in each sentence. And like we said, that's where the POA comes in with the oral module on HIV as an exercise in praxis, and I think that's been very nicely explained this morning. But this was something entirely new for me. So yeah, just to kind of touch on what the few significant experiences I've had in India. I started out as a teacher at a residential learning center. It's in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh, where I have my paternal home. And this center is actually quite a good transition. It's the most natural transition I think could have been from POA, because they also use Freirean in their educational philosophy, specifically in problem-posing methods and school curriculum that's determined by the community, by the indigenous community that lives there, with the specific purpose of conscientizing students and working towards like a progressive society, building a progressive society. So these were all things I was familiar with through the class, but to see it like, you know, in rural India, some place that I had no connection with, was very, you know, I could make applications. Do you want to show that? Thank you. It's just a small photo of where I was. I didn't include too many pictures, but just to give you a sense of the space. So this was my home for 2 years. After 2 years, the name of this institution is called Adharshila, and that means it's the stone that you put in the ground before you make a building, the foundation stone. So that's kind of their approach to education as well. So after 2 years at Adharshila, I got a position as an agricultural researcher. I became interested in those issues because agriculture was kind of the most relevant thing for students in that community. So a lot of the curriculum was also based, whether you're talking about math or science or even history, a lot of it was based on issues of land and access. So it was nice to kind of move to the capital city, which is about an overnight train journey from this place. And, you know, aside from looking at crop data and irrigation data and doing mathematical work on that, which was interesting in itself, was the community, the university community itself. So this is kind of just very surface kind of picture of what goes on at Jawaharlal Nehru University. It's kind of known for its student culture, its student politics. And so yeah, I forged a lot of good relationships with students there. I learned quite a bit about how different struggles in different parts of the country get centralized in this place and how different groups kind of interact with that. It was a real kind of, I never experienced that at Michigan because I was there for a year with Dr. Neith and then I left. So it's kind of like my experience there. And then lastly, I spent a couple years in the state of Jharkhand, kind of understanding issues of land and mining and displacement that's going on there. So yeah, I just wanted to show you kind of the scenes. But to talk a little bit about how POA consciousness has affected me, I want to talk about so as a teacher who cannot speak her students' native language, there are many implications and questions that I had. One relates to the colonialism of these missionary and religious schools, which communicate to students that they are backward and that they must shed their history and their language and assimilate with the dominant culture. And especially most of these are first generation learners as well. So at the center though where I worked, the students were encouraged to read and write and speak their native language, while at the same time excel in English. I noticed that the older students didn't like speaking in their native languages, and they would look to me to speak and converse with in English. They were always amused as to why I was interested in learning their language, as I already knew English. And I have a sense now that, I was arrogant in this process, that in my attempt to kind of declass myself, to totally immerse, it was at the expense of exoticizing them. Being an American volunteer in an Indian village, obviously reflects a lot of privilege and charity. But I remember how I would often be triggered when, you know, my upper caste and class, like relatives and family would, you know, perceive me as a savior and me, and, you know, aggrandize me to that status, while at the same time denigrating, you know, lower caste people, tribal communities. So it was just this constant, like, how do I manage these two worlds? And the difference, and again, a lot of this is stuff we've talked about in the class, but it's, you know, it's crazy how it's taken me so long to really believe these things. But the difference between charity and development is that critical consciousness. And, you know, and I feel that in India, you know, I have privileges of caste, of class, of race, of color, of language, of region, and of citizenship. So it's like managing those things is of the utmost importance. I think I don't have much time.
90 seconds.
90 seconds. Okay, so then I'll skip. Just say the last thing I wanted to say. I think the development of consciousness pushes me to realize that I'm an intensely, you know, privileged foreigner in this country of my origin, but also that India makes foreigners of its own people based on histories of dehumanization and the complexity of geographical borders. And lastly, we say that consciousness is both a gift and a burden, but to me, it kind of seems these are static descriptions, and kind of like what Rocky was saying in his opening quote, that it's a method, that it's a tool to uncover and respond to the world. And obviously the POA space has, you know, imbibed us with this, and I just, yeah, through this questioning of self and surroundings. So I have this quote. It's not from Freirean. I know that's kind of outrageous. But as I was just packing up in India just now, I was in a bookstore and I found this. So communication for me has been always a kind of a struggle, but it's getting better. And I'll just read the quote. I am here. Those three words contain all that can be said. You begin with those words and you return to them. Here means on this earth, on this continent, and no other. In this city and no other. In this epoch I call mine, this century, this year. I was given no other place, no other time, and I touch my desk to defend myself against the feeling that my own body is transient. This is all very fundamental, but after all, the science of life depends on the gradual discovery of fundamental truths.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
You know, one of the dangers of going after lunch and also being last on the panel is that we get into this little slump. So I'll say it one more time. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So I think what will be helpful first is to situate myself, you know, following through with praxis, situate myself with a theoretical framing. So I'm going to draw on a quote, actually, that Sammy referenced as well. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. So to reintroduce myself, I'm Carson Phillips, so I'm currently pursuing a master's in higher education and student affairs, which is essentially I'm learning how to work within a university context, which also, let me add, is very difficult and challenging, but I'm sure Nisha can attest to that. So my own concern really is with issues of access related to social class and race. Really, my primary passion area is understanding the experience of social mobility and being able to better understand also how American institutions of higher education facilitate the process of upward mobility. So, so in thinking about this, I am a first-generation college student, in meaning that my parents did not have a college degree. So I come from a working class background, which at the University of Michigan has been very, I think I've struggled with this a lot, thinking about how to take ownership and how to sort of also feel this sense of belonging within the overall university community. So I'm going to walk us through a timeline of sort of my time with Nisha, and from there I hope to sort of think back about how it shaped my own involvement with first gens and also issues of access. So my first course with Nisha was in fall of 2011, and similar to what Rocky said, my world was flipped. I was a sophomore. I was very much still unexposed to the realities of the world. And I really didn't understand, I don't think, what it meant for me to also be going to a university and pursuing these things that many of the members of my community back home did not have the ability to do so. So this was really when I sat there in a lot of her classes and my jaw just dropped because I didn't know how to respond. I didn't even know if I was understanding what she was saying. Which, I mean, that's still the reality, let's be real. But so that, for me, that was really, that was where it all began. So in winter of 2012, I was in Nisha's preparation course for the trip, and we did a lot of readings. We read, Steve Biko, we read Paulo Freire, and we continued to learn about the history of South Africa. This was also the same time where I went to the first meeting for the first generation college student group at Michigan. And this is where I sort of began to reflect on my overall experience at the University of Michigan. My trip to South Africa in 2012 was my first time abroad. It was my first time outside the US. It was my first time living in a house of non-white people. So it was very much so an experience of me thinking about a lot of these things. I returned in fall of 2012, and I began to take on the majority of my work was with a student organization called First Generation College Students at Michigan. And what this organization was that it was an opportunity really for students to be able to find community with peers who had a very similar experience. It was an opportunity for them to also critique the institution while still also being funded and supported as an organization from the institution. So I became heavily involved with the student organization. I served on the executive board with a great team of other first-gen leaders. And then it brings me to Jamaica of 2013, which my trip in Jamaica served as an additional context to really think critically about issues of access to information, which is really at the root of pedagogy of action, is thinking about how can we create ways for people who do not have a formal education, and but yet have many other great experiences and have tons of other knowledge bases. How can we create an opportunity for them to still have access to information and understand it at its most in its most elementary sense? So, in fall of 2013, I continued my work with first-gen students. I began to have more conversations with administrators and university stakeholders about the experience of first-gens. So the reason why I bring all that up is because I think it's important for me to situate myself so that you can understand the lens that I'm taking through it and also how some of these experiences have shaped my POA consciousness. For me, in a sense, the module is created for members of my community. It is created for members who have not had access to pursue additional education. It's created for members of my community who in one sense have been they've been wronged by the system. And as I think about this, I also think about how the institution serves as an avenue for upward mobility. And what we need to understand is that the experience of upward mobility is lonely. It is a lengthy process that requires persistence and patience. We also need to understand that American institutions of higher education encourage students to divest from their own communities, from their own neighborhoods that raised them, and from the families and friends back home who endlessly supported them. And for me, one of them is on the line right now, and I have to thank my mother for being on the line.
No.
But, as I think about this though, what attracts me to pedagogy of action is that last statement about divesting from their own communities. Dr. Hanif's module is against that. Her way that she teaches me to think about my own community of first-gen students is against leaving them. It is supporting them, and it is learning to work within the system, as Rocky mentioned. It's learning how can we sort of exist within the system, and for me, exist as also an employee of the university, but critique it and trying to find avenues to create social change. So, I feel like I'm very anti-university right now, which I'm not, but universities tell students also that they can be successful, that they can achieve great things. And drawing back to what I referenced earlier about upward mobility, what universities do not explain is that this often comes at a cost. And that this cost is especially high for low-income and first-generation students. It requires low-income students to take on a new habitus, or a new way of living, a new way sort of how do they approach the world? How do they move within different contexts? So then it leads me to, how then do we best support these students in their transition into an entirely different world? Into a world that they're completely unfamiliar with, that their main support systems in their life are unfamiliar with. And so, in order to interrogate this, and in order to interrogate other systems of oppression, one must be aware of these structures that are in place. And this requires a level of consciousness. And for me, that is where my POA consciousness has come from, and that is what it has turned into. POA has empowered me to take ownership of my educational journey. And as with many others, my consciousness is a result of POA, but also, more primarily, a result of Nisha. For many, higher education provides the scaffolding for upward mobility. It provides these opportunities for immense growth. And so in thinking about that, I think about how sort of POA connects to my overall consciousness, and how essentially that growth required me to move into higher education. I feel like this is getting long, but so building one's consciousness is an ongoing process. It requires one to constantly and consistently engage in praxis. POA teaches you how to operate within a system while still existing within that system. I have learned how to critique American institutions of higher education while still working, being employed, supported, and also studying within one. And let me tell you, Nisha will agree that this is still not a simple task. It's an ongoing process that I continue to learn how to balance. And for me, as I think about that, it turns into also a conversation of learning when to address structural inequities and how to help other students recognize their own sense of agency within a university setting. So for the sake of time, without going over too much, but what I'd like to just, I think, end on and think about overall is that these systems of oppression exist, but we must find a way to also exist within them and find a way to hopefully promote some social change. The first gen group for me was a very rewarding experience. It created an opportunity for me to really be with others, find a supportive community, and also find others who are equally disappointed in the realities of our world and the way that higher education manifests. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the opening quote was, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed." But to end, I want to say that I may be the first, but I will not be the last.
So I'm not sure, how much time do we have for questions?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay.
My question, can you hear me? Okay. My question is for Rocky. And when you talk about New Orleans, I still immediately think about Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I don't know if my mind just connects to it. I was 8 years old when that happened. So I guess thinking about that, and I know people still do connect New Orleans to Hurricane Katrina. What's the hardest part working in those communities where people think the levees were broken in their poor communities, and they're still, I guess, they're rebuilding even 10 years later, trying to talk about HIV while they're still rebuilding poor neighborhoods, I guess trying to work through all of that still. What's the hardest part?
Oh man, I don't know if there's a hardest part. but always just acknowledging and affirming whoever I'm talking to. If you believe something, I gotta take you at your word, because most people don't pull stuff out of thin air. Some people will say, well, poverty causes HIV. Yeah, it's not a direct transmission route, but there's a point to that. So you have to look at the structural causes that place people in certain situations that limit their choices. So you have to, I will be very open and honest with folks about that. You say, oh, well, because, if you look at epidemiology, with New Orleans, Louisiana is very similar to other places in the world where you have things like, oh, it's men who have sex with men are most likely people to get it. Black men who have sex with men. So I'm not going to go in and say, well, you have to use a condom every single time. Like, let's have a conversation about that. There we go, sorry. So let's have a conversation about that. Like, what is limiting your ability to make choices, or what empowers you to make choices, and see if we can figure something out. So yeah, it's difficult tackling all those issues, because if you don't have access to housing or transportation, or someone's telling you how you live your life is somehow wrong, I can't do that. That's not my place. Let's just figure out how we can reduce our risks and what can we do to work around it. But I'll be very open and honest. Me being a white person, primarily from Michigan, my reality is different. So let's have a dialogue and see what we can work with.
My question is actually for Dr. Hanif, and it has to do with it has to do with the questioning of self that happened, the questioning of self and environment that happens through your program. How do you see managing the next steps? We're talking about 15 years of the pedagogical action in South Africa, and so how do you see managing the next steps after you hear individuals questioning themselves and their environment in this way?
The next step in terms of the future of POA?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't, first of all, I have a problem with the question.
Oh.
Because the question is focused on me and what I'm supposed to do. And it is not for me, it is for these people and all of you to take responsibility. I mean, I've been working at this for a very long time. It is not easy to have people question and face their own racism, their own sexism, their own privilege, and it's not easy. And I do this because it is my way to deal with social justice and so issues of social injustice. And you can either work on the front line, or you can either work with people who can actually be in positions to change the world. And I've said this many times, that it is not people on the front lines who change the world. It is the educated person, the person who can write, who can articulate, who can speak. Martin Luther King had a PhD. Mao Zedong was an educated Confucian peasant. Che Guevara was a doctor. So was Fidel Castro. If you go through all of the list of people who brought about social change, they had to have the masses to support them. But they were the ones who were at the front line. It doesn't mean that they were alone. But these are very important things. And I think a lot of people miss that is a population that needs a lot of work, a lot of intensive work. And so my answer to your question about the future is that I have played my part. And I will continue to help and support you all. But it is your responsibility now. And I think that somebody was asking or discussing earlier today that there has to be a niche who can do whatever. Well, I don't know if there has to be a niche. Things continue and things change. So POA will not be the same if I'm not doing it. It may not continue to exist, but I believe that it has to exist. I believe if I invest in you, it will continue in some way. Otherwise, the whole thing is pointless. That's my answer.
Thank
Carson, also anyone in the audience that wants to contribute. So my question is, what do you think the limitations are of the actual module to teach consciousness?
Well, you gotta have a dialogue. But that, I'm glad you brought that up, because when I teach it, I'm limited on time, so I have to be honest about that, right? So I can't necessarily spend 3 or 4 days just on the module. I ain't got that kind of time. But I can have a dialogue about that. Okay, so these are the 4 ways. What kinds of things have you heard in your community? Well, I heard you can get it through saliva. Okay, let's break that down. Why? And how can you talk about who you're working with, about how to break down those myths or those barriers? So there's always inherent limitations with the module itself, and banking. We have to be honest about that. I bank. I'm a banker, right? But at certain points I have to. So I have to find ways to bank, but then to be conscious outside of that banking method and figure out how to have praxis that includes elements of that. There's no way to get around that. But that's my
I have a question for Carson. I think that one of the things that's interesting about your work with First Gens is that Carson doesn't say this, and your mother's online still, right? Okay, good. Because you didn't say about it very much, but when you began with First Gens, there were about 10 people involved in First Gens. And when you left, he was the president of First Gens, and when he left it, there were like over 60 people in First Gens. And last year, the provost of the University of Michigan gave money to First Gens and is giving it its own building or office or something. So it has risen in visibility, and I think it's largely the foundational work was done by Carson. So it's not that POA should be continuing in the way that you were taught, but to be illustrated in different ways. So now that you're out of First Gens, how do you feel about its growth and its evolution?
Well, as Nisha mentioned, the group has grown tremendously. And I think for me, what is most empowering, or that I'm most proud of, is that knowing that when I left, that there were people there who were able to take it on. And I'm humbled by that, because a lot of the progress that's taken place this year has been tremendous. The whole notion that the University of Michigan wants to think about the creation of a center that specifically thinks about First Gen issues, in reality, that's a statement that social class differences exist, and that these differences are real, and that they are experienced by tons of students on the college campuses. So for me, it's interesting to think about, because I was worried. I was a little bit worried, at the beginning about what First Gens, how the student organization would function without me, because I invested a lot of time into it. I invested a lot of my resources, but I was not the only one, and that's what's important, is that I was there to help facilitate it, alongside others who helped facilitate it. But I was really, it's being continued, and I know that as I hear about, the graduation ceremony that took place this year, and it's nearly doubled in size from last year. Those are things that I'm not there, and I'm not the one doing the work. I'm no longer on the front line. I am now no longer on the front line at the University of Michigan. But the way that I'm approaching it is that I am hoping to be more on the front line of my work will be on the front line within the university, within the policies, within the ways that we think about First Gen issues and other social class issues. And beyond that, it's not even, I don't want to only focus on social class, because there are huge parallels to race, and I don't want to end this without saying that. But for me, it's really thinking about how can we take this take the academy, which for me, it's these ideas of utopia. How can we create this better society where people are valued, where people are encouraged to, to love one another and be part of a community? How can we take these values and how can we actually put them forth within the real world? And that's, I think, where I'm at with it, is thinking that there are these other people who are on the work who are on the front lines that are doing the work, and I'm sort of re-energized by it, and I'm reminded that although I exist within the system, and although I somewhat perpetuate the system, which is essentially what a lot of my work does, I still have the ability to be aware of it and to be conscious, but also to critique it and to help others who are moving into these positions of power to critique it.
Okay, so my question, for whoever wants to answer it, you all talked about generically building consciousness, but I think something that I've seen a lot, particularly in the university setting, and I think particularly with students who come from marginalized communities, is once they've built their own sense of consciousness, there's a sense of resentment for the communities from which they came, for not doing that for them. And I think, Carson, you were talking about how students often divest from their communities because of the university setting, I think this is one part of that, but I guess my question is, how do you build a sense of compassion or understanding within students while still allowing them to build that sense of consciousness so they can go back and do that for others in their community?
Want to say the question one more time? Just the last part.
So I guess how do you allow students to build a sense of consciousness but still maintain sort of compassion and understanding for those from their community who don't necessarily have that yet?
I think that's the biggest struggle. I think personally that's really the struggle for me, is that when I especially and I think back to my own experience, there were many times where when I felt most at home or felt that I belonged at the university was in conversations with custodial staff or other staff members. And what does that mean? Because the reality is what we would hope within the university is that we find these peers who our experience is very similar to. And that's what I think the first gen group is slowly evolving into, is that. But building the consciousness portion is difficult, in that it's an ongoing process. I'm still very much so developing my consciousness. And I think the struggle is, once we get outside of an educational setting as well, how can we truly engage in it? Obviously through dialogue and stuff like that, but the difficulties are there, most definitely. I don't think I answered your question, but that's my attempt.
We all learn from somewhere. We're here, and we're here, and we're here, and we're here, but we all learn at different points, so you always have to keep that in mind. Not everybody can be where you are, so you gotta feed them nuggets. We give you a nugget to chew on, and then once you've digested that, let's have another nugget to chew on. So you always gotta keep that in mind. So that's what Nisha does. She gives people, we gotta meet, where you at? Where are you at? And let's work.
That was an interesting question, because I'm overawed by the amount of, let me just say, intellectual power or intellect that's sitting in this room, which then means that with the way that people are talking, the things that you're saying means that applying that brain power means that at some point we've got to win. I can take my own circumstances. I grew up extremely poor. There wasn't any program that impacted on me or changed my life for the better, or I just thought there has to be something more than this there has to be something better. I deserve more. And yes, that conflict when you manage to get out, and then you have to start questioning your motives for going back to help. Is it because you want to empower people to help themselves, or is it because you are almost denying your own existence, where you come from, and trying to, the way Sami spoke earlier on about the Palestinian-Israeli struggle, you want to obliterate your past so that it doesn't figure in your memory at all. Which is why my statements earlier on came about, because that whole analogy about teaching a man to fish rather than giving him the fish and walking away because he's going to be fed for a couple of hours and he's not going to want to do it for himself after that. It comes to bear because it is important that we have to remember that it has to be about leaving something behind that's going to grow and snowball. Which when you look at again, you look at POA and the number of alumni that have come out of it, because those 300 people that you mentioned, those 300 people trained like 20 people every time they've been somewhere, and those 20 people are continuing to train. And we need to get that kind of movement going in the world, because activism means nothing. It honestly means nothing. It means that you're going to get a sense of pride in what you've been able to achieve, or your profile, or being able to stand up on a podium and saying, I'm Dr. So-and-so and I study public health here, there. Yeah, but you need to use it. And you need to use it in a way that's not going to come, it's not a reflection on you, but rather a reflection of, or outward, an outward sort of focus rather than an internal focus.
We will now be moving on to our fifth panel, entitled Who is the Recipient? A dialogue between South African and U.S. partners on the political and ideological issues of U.S. aid. This will be moderated by Dr.